Welcome to our series of innocent spouse relief questions. Today we're going to cover Internal Revenue Code 6015B, which is innocent spouse relief. We're going to cover the 5 qualifications that the Internal Revenue Service considers when making a determination based on a request for relief submitted on IRS Form 8857. So there are 5 relief qualifications. 1, a joint return must have been filed for the year in which relief is requested. So if a requesting spouse filed a separate return, head of household return, got divorced and filed a single return, none of those are eligible for innocent spouse relief. They might be eligible for relief under another program, just not under Internal Revenue Code section 6015B. 2, there's an understatement of tax that is attributable to erroneous items from the non-requesting spouse. So the other spouse made some sort of mistake, error, misrepresented items on the tax return. Whatever that case is, it is the fault of the other spouse, not the requesting spouse. 3, the requesting spouse did not know and did not have reason to know of the understatement at the time the return was signed. 4, taking into account all the facts and circumstances, the IRS decides that it would not be fair to hold the requesting spouse liable for the underpayment that's attributable to the other spouse. And then 5, the request for relief is made within 2 years from the date of the first collection activity with respect to the requesting spouse. So we'll talk a little bit more in depth on each of these items. Let's start with the joint tax return requirement. So the first requirement is that a valid joint return was filed for the taxable year in which relief is being requested. Now, there is a note here that if the requesting spouse did not file a joint return but lives in a community property state, they might be eligible for relief under a different section of the tax code. That would be a topic for a different discussion. That would be within the Internal Revenue Manual 2515.5, relief from community property laws. 2, understatement that is attributable to an erroneous item from the non-requesting spouse. So a couple of key things here. Understatement of tax. So if the IRS isn't coming after you and you have paid all of your taxes, you might not get relief because you've already paid the taxes and the IRS really doesn't have anything to look at. But it must be something that the other spouse did. If the requesting spouse did something, misrepresented something, or was included on a joint item that was understated in terms of tax, then they're not eligible for relief for that. Simply put, what the IRS will be considering is whether or not the other spouse did something specifically to understate their tax liability, erroneous items such as income, taxes withheld, deductions, credits. Attribution is going to be the first thing that an examiner looks for. Attribution basically means there's an item in the tax return, which spouse did it? Which spouse is most likely to be accountable for that mistake? And then math errors. So one of the ways that the IRS makes a determination on the involvement of the requesting spouse is whether or not the requesting spouse had actual or constructive knowledge of the understatement when the tax return was signed. So lack of actual knowledge would mean that the spouse did not know, and they also have to demonstrate a lack of constructive knowledge. They didn't have a reason to know. Like, for example, if I had a joint banking account with my wife and my wife said that she wrote a check for $10,000 to the IRS, I could not know legitimately, but since I have access to the banking account, I probably should have known whether or not she wrote a check and whether or not it was deposited with the IRS. Sometimes a spouse might have their own business, they might be self-employed, and they have a lot of information that that both spouses might not have access to, that the requesting spouse could say, I didn't know about my spouse's business dealings or separate income holdings, for example. So there is an exception that needs to be discussed, and it's if a spouse establishes that he or she was a victim of domestic abuse, and there are questions on this tax form to ask about domestic abuse and whether or not the IRS can talk to the requesting spouse about their situation. If they knew, but they decided not to question the tax return because of duress or fear of retaliation, then there is an exception to this actual and constructive requirement. The IRS would consider innocent spouse relief for a requesting spouse that knew what was going on, but signed the tax return out of fear of retaliation. So some of the things that an examiner would look at is the nature of the erroneous item, how much that erroneous item was compared to everything else in that tax return, the couple's overall financial situation, the requesting spouse's educational background and business experience. For example, a tax accountant requesting innocent spouse relief is probably not going to get as far or get the benefit of the doubt in the same manner that a requesting spouse who only has a high school diploma might. Whether or not the requesting spouse failed to inquire about items on the return, omitted from the return, that a reasonable person would question. So the IRS has to kind of empathize with what would a reasonable person do with the facts at hand. And this goes back to the form itself. When you're completing the 8857, keep this in mind when making your request, that you're actually having to give an examiner enough information so that they can decide for themselves whether or not an objective, reasonable third party would make similar decisions as you would. So make sure that you're giving the examiner as much information as you can so they can come to the same conclusion. And the final item, whether or not this erroneous item is consistent with previous tax returns or if it was a departure. Those are all things that an examiner will consider. So the fourth requirement is if the IRS determines that it would not be equitable or fair to hold the requesting spouse liable. And again, some of the facts and circumstances are whether or not the requesting spouse received a significant benefit, in excess of normal spousal support, their education level, the involvement of the requesting spouse in household finances. I mean, you go back to domestic abuse situations. One form of domestic abuse is financial abuse, where a requesting spouse is, to no fault of their own, made completely dependent on the other spouse for the most minute and unsophisticated financial decisions. They're completely trapped by that spouse, and they might not be involved in the household finances at all because the other spouse won't let them be. Whether the other spouse deserted the requesting spouse, the health of the requesting spouse, economic hardships, whether or not there was deceit or lying, deception involved, whether or not there was abuse, whether the requesting spouse received a tax benefit. All of these things will be kind of evaluated. And there's parts of the Internal Revenue Manual that go step by step for the examiner to make their own decisions. And before you try to pick apart the Internal Revenue Manual yourself, it goes into pretty deep detail. I mean, the beginning of the chapter on innocent spouse relief talks about mailroom procedures to make sure that mail goes to the appropriate office, whether it's innocent spouse or whether it's a different part of the tax code. So it starts at the very beginning, from when the IRS actually receives an envelope in the mail all the way through final disposition, and then there's guidance on how to inform the taxpayer and manage it through the collections process. So this is a very detailed set of procedures. We're just looking at a very small part of it. And then the time period for requesting relief has to be within 2 years, and there are additional references to the Internal Revenue Manual for more information. So stay tuned. We'll be covering some of the other aspects of requesting relief in upcoming videos. Thank you.